Hi everyone, welcome to part 4 of World War II. Our questions to think about are, how does World War II end, and how does the end of World War II set up the post-war conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union? As we've talked about before, we don't really talk a lot about battles and generals and tactics in this class, but I want to sort of recap how World War II ends because it's going to impact what happens once the war is over. So when the United States gets involved in World War II directly at the end of 1941 and early 1942, keep in mind where Europe is at in this moment. So France was defeated in 1940. Britain is really holding on in what we call the Western Front on the western side of Germany. And Germany's also fighting the Soviets, Russia, on the Eastern Front. So even though Hitler had tried to avoid fighting a two-front war, that's really what he's doing. But by the time we get into late 1941, the Soviet Union is really taking on the brunt of the conflict with Germany, and they're struggling. The Soviet Army, or the Red Army, is losing huge amounts of men and supplies daily. So what Joseph Stalin is going to demand is that the U.S. allies reopen the Western Front so that it alleviates much of the pressure from the Soviet Union. But when the United States gets into the war, they don't do that. They start off fighting in North Africa and moving across North Africa from Morocco towards Egypt and then moving up into Italy. This was considered by American military commanders to be the soft underbelly of Europe, the vulnerable part. So by 1943, U.S. allies are moving into Italy. Once the Italians are defeated, Germany actually pours troops, German troops, into Italy to continue the fighting there. But at this point, Stalin is suspicious. He begins to question why the Allies simply don't restart the fighting in France. Like, why aren't U.S. troops moving into France and taking the pressure off the Soviet Union? There's a whole backstory we're going to get into a little bit later, but Stalin is essentially paranoid that the Western Allies are trying to let the Soviet Union die, that they're basically not coming to their rescue on purpose. When the Allies do finally open up the Western Front, it begins with this massive campaign that we call Operation Overlord. It's sometimes referred to as D-Day, June 6, 1944. We see hundreds of thousands of troops that have been staging in Britain make their way across the English Channel and open up that Western Front. Now, the frustrating thing is that the Germans have been really secure in their locations here. They've been in this part of France since 1940, so they're really dug in to their entrenchments, and they're able to defend the coast of France very well. But what's going to make Operation Overlord successful is this continuous wave of Allied troops coming over. I mean, by the time we get 2 weeks into this operation, the Allies have landed over 1 million troops on the coast of France, and they're going to begin pushing their way into Germany. By the time we get into the early part of 1945, Allied troops are right on the border. And meanwhile, Soviet troops are pushing their way westward. And so by the end of April, Hitler gives up. He commits suicide. And on May 8th, 1945, the German government formally surrenders. This is sometimes referred to as VE Day, Victory in Europe. Meanwhile, the US is fighting the Japanese in the Pacific theater. The biggest challenge here is geography. When you take a look at the map, you can see just this huge geographic expanse that Japan effectively controls. This is going to be an impossible task for the American military to try to regain control over each and every one of these places. So instead, the US military is going to adopt a practice of island hopping, which means just fighting on some strategic islands and simply going around others. The goal, however, is to make their way toward Japan. So I have two battles here that I want to talk about. The first is the Battle of Iwo Jima, fought in February of 1945. Iwo Jima is located just 750 miles from Japan. And what the American military realizes is just how desperately the Japanese are going to defend that island, to defend themselves. Then moving on into June of 1945, we have the Battle of Okinawa, which is one of the deadliest battles of World War II for the American military. And when we take a look at this, we're just 350 miles from Japan. And again, the Japanese are fighting so desperately not to lose. We start to see huge numbers of kamikaze pilots used in battles, where pilots deliberately crash their airplanes into American ships and troop collections so that they destroy everything that they can. At the end, the Americans do win the Battle of Okinawa, but we see 50,000 American casualties. That means the number of dead plus the number of wounded. But the Japanese suffer over 100,000 dead at just the Battle of Okinawa. And the reason this is important is because it's going to affect how the Japanese are going to end this war, or how the American military is going to be forced to end this conflict. These battles are significant because it let the Americans know that the Japanese were not going to give up without a fight, that they were going to fight down to the bitter end. So this is significant because it's going to affect how the war in the Pacific ends. Taking a step back to 1939, the U.S. military had been working on a top secret project codenamed the Manhattan Project in an effort to try to develop atomic weaponry before Germany did. And in July of 1945, the United States is going to successfully test the first atomic weapon at Alamogordo, New Mexico. We'll talk a little bit more about the timing of that test in a little bit. But one other thing I want to point out here is that in April of 1945, President Franklin Roosevelt died. And so his vice president, Harry Truman, is going to have to make the decisions about whether or not to use these weapons. And Truman does decide, with the assistance of his military advisors. President Truman makes the decision that the path of least death, I mean, surprisingly, the path of least death would be using atomic weapons on Japan to force them to surrender. Some military commanders had argued that the better way to go would be an invasion of the Japanese home island. So basically sort of like an Operation Overlord sort of strategy, that we just put huge numbers of American military personnel on the beach and work our way into forcing a Japanese surrender. But other military commanders argued that we could expect at least 1 million American casualties from that kind of operation. And that's not even including how many Japanese military personnel would die and how many Japanese civilians would die. So given the advice of his advisors, President Truman makes the decision to use the atomic weapons on Japan. And the Japanese would surrender September 2nd, 1945. As we come into the end of the war, the Allies are going to be working on what do we do next. So first of all, I want to give you a term here, the Grand Alliance. This is the military alliance between the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union. And the leaders of those three nations were referred to as the Big Three. So in the photograph here from the left, we have British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, the American President Franklin Roosevelt, and on the right is Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. When these men met in February of 1945, they're meeting at the town of Yalta on the Black Sea. And so one of the biggest points of discussion is what to do with the areas that were liberated from Nazi Germany, because the Soviets have spent much of the war trying to push their way westward. And so they're occupying places in Eastern Europe on their march westward. And there was some concern from Churchill and Roosevelt that Stalin might not be willing to let these territories go at the end of the war. So at the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin is going to make the promise that once the war is over, that these areas would be granted self-determination, that they would be able to govern themselves. Now, what's interesting about that is everyone knew that Stalin wasn't going to keep that promise, but they allow him to sort of make this gesture. The other thing is, what do we do with Germany? I mean, Germany has twice in 50 years caused a world war. So how do we deal with that going forward? And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. As I mentioned, President Roosevelt died in April of 1945. So in May, Germany is defeated. And there is another conference just outside of Berlin in the suburb of Potsdam. So it's July of 1945, and President Harry Truman has just learned about the new atomic bombs. Harry Truman understands that our alliance with the Soviet Union is really a marriage of convenience, that we don't really have any sort of bond necessarily with the Soviet Union. And this is really just something we need to do to defeat Nazi Germany. So when Harry Truman learns about the atomic test at Alamogordo, New Mexico, he drops this hint to Stalin that we have something that will keep you in line. And Stalin's response was, I already know. I knew before you did. And there's a good chance that he did, because Soviet spies were very good. But we have to sort of understand how this animosity between the United States and the Soviet Union is going to affect the post-war situation, particularly in Europe. We have to come to the realization that the Soviet Union is in actual physical control of Eastern Europe. We'll talk more about that a little later. So thinking about our questions, how does World War II end? In Europe, it ends with the massive wave of Allied troops coming over from Britain, beginning with Operation Overlord. The Western allies, Britain and the United States, come in from the west. The Soviet Union squeezes Germany from the east, and in May of 1945, Germany surrenders. In the Pacific, the strategy of island hopping has pushed the Japanese back, but it's the atomic bombs that actually force the Japanese surrender. And then finally, how does the end of World War II set up the post-war conflict between the US and the Soviet Union? A lot of it has to do with that delay in opening up the Western Front. Stalin is suspicious, and he becomes angry that by the end of the war, Stalin is convinced that the US is trying to find a way to destroy the Soviet Union. And we'll talk more about that a little later.